First, a little bit about the history of predicting human behavior. In 1662, John Grant, he demonstrated how, despite the fact that individual deaths were unpredictable, deaths in the aggregate were actually quite predictable. And he is today known as the father of demography. It took 100 years after his epistemological invention to start the field of insurance, which we have today as well. And in fact, it's valued at over 7 trillion US dollars in 2023. Since then, we've come a long way. In 1835, Kepler, this French guy, was like, oh, we can apply the normal distribution to population prediction, and we can do it in other aspects of human behavior, not just to their deaths. And he showed how we can predict people's height, weight, strength with the normal distribution, and he was quite successful in his endeavor. Leading up to the 20th century, in 1936, there was a key election in the United States, Alfred Langdon versus Roosevelt, and Literary Digest sent out 10 million what they called mock ballots, and they got 2.4 million back. They thought that if they could tabulate all of the responses they got back with such a large sample size, they could easily predict the outcome of the election. In fact, they were completely wrong. And this guy, Gallup, he sampled a small population of 50,000 people who were using quota sampling and demonstrated not only that he could predict the right winner, but also the magnitude by which Roosevelt was going to win the election. Fast forward to after the Second World War, we have the Defense Research Complex, and people are trying to apply technology to all sorts of things. In 1959, we have the Semilattice Corporation, which rose to fame by trying to help Kennedy in the 1960 election in his campaign. In fact, later we found out that a lot of their predictions were actually just common sense disguised in what the machine could do and could not do. In follow-up contracts that they got from the New York Times to predict the 1962 midterm election, as well as a DARPA contract to try and win over the South Vietnamese, the American cause in the Vietnam War, they were, well, not very good, to say the least. And in 1970, they closed shop and haven't existed since. Then someone was like, why don't we approach this problem from the bottom up instead of the top down? We're going to try and figure out how independent people behave, and we're going to try and see if that can lead to the emergent behavior that we see in the aggregate. That leads us to the Schelling model. This guy, in fact, won the Nobel Prize for his work a few years ago. And he demonstrated how, even with very simple, hard-coded rules about how individual human beings behave, you could predict real-world observable behavior. And here we are today. The individual aggregate gap still exists. We haven't dissolved it. We have not managed to simulate the behavior of individual human beings across wide domains well enough to be able to draw aggregate insights, at least not to wide domains, not when it's more than just one specific type of behavior. That's where we come in, right? We can see that when we're trying to predict stable trends, that's actually quite easy. But when we try to predict transient aggregates like election results, that's much difficult. But that's why we have opinion polling. We can measure that instead. A lot of people have actually tried to use LLMs to simulate human behavior in the last few years. But most of those methods have these three key failures. First of all, they flatten behavior of human beings to central tendencies. It's like LLMs can predict how the average person will behave, but they can't predict how a wide variety of people will behave. In fact, as we do more and more reinforcement learning from human feedback to make these models better assistants, we actually make them worse simulators of human behavior. There's also prompt bitterness, like the way in which you phrase a question changes the way in which these models respond, the way in which you organize your options to a multiple choice question changes the way in which these models respond, which is obviously not ideal. Then there's also bias. These models often misportray certain demographics by they kind of lean into the stereotypes rather than showing how especially underrepresented groups actually behave in the real world. And despite the fact that they have demonstrated high scores on certain benchmarks, like this Twin 2K500 study, when they're tested on novel stimulus, they're actually very loosely correlated with the individuals that they're trying to simulate. This is the measure that the field has settled on. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the maths of it all. Effectively, this is trying to measure how close a model responds to what the real expected response is. For example, on a 1 to 7 item scale, predicting a 6 against a true 5 scores a 0.83. It's just trying to see how close you are to the real response, because otherwise, if you just rely off of accuracy, that's 1 or 0, and like whether the response was supposed to be a 6 or a 2 makes a big difference to how you score a 5. This is where we come in. We're calling our new model Anacreon. It's a mixture of minds, sort of like the mixture of experts that all LLMs use. This is our training pipeline. So we collect public data from real people, and we structure that as stimuluses and stimuli and responses. The stimuli that we collect kind of depends on the population that we're trying to model. In this case, for example, we're trying to model people's financial preferences. So you go and collect a lot of data on people talking about their financial preferences on the internet, and you try to model how they may behave. After we've collected this data, we do clustering based on the preferences that they behave. We're basically trying to figure out what the trends are. We can create something like 400 seed people that we've found who display different types of behavior, and then we can try to match other data that we collect to these 400 people to augment their data sets. In addition to doing this clustering for data augmentation, we also try and mine attributes about their behavior. This just comes from the idea that you can often infer people's private traits from the way in which they behave in public. You can infer things like how old a person may be, where a person may live, what kind of investments a person may have made based on how they behave on internet forums. And we can take that and we can try and condition their response to that stimulus based on these inferred traits. This is what we call chain of motion. If you've ever looked at any of the LLM apps that you may use, like Claude or ChatGPT, you can click through and you can see what the chain of thought of that model might be. That's supposed to be how the model has thought through its response to your question. Instead of that, we're trying to look at how a person may emotionally react to a stimulus. And we're trying to model how their emotional states may transition from one to the other, leading to the final response. After we've done this, we train a bunch of different models, one for each cluster of real users that we have collected. And these form our Anacreon population that we can then use to do predictions on novel stimulus that was not in the training set. And then in order to do our accuracy validation, we use that same score that I mentioned earlier. And on that, as a whole population, Anacreon scores a 0.775, which is state-of-the-art, better than anyone has ever achieved from just naive prompting of LLMs with personas. At the end, for this particular model that we're presenting today for a specific Semilattice customer, we ended up with 400 clusters, around 260 million parameters trained per cluster, which results in a total of 110 billion across 400 models. Once unpacked at inference times, this is a model with 4.9 trillion parameters. This is on the scale of the largest open source LLMs, in fact, even larger than most of the biggest open source LLMs that we have to date. And checkpoints, i.e., when you stop the training process, is selected from what the target outcome is, which is ordinal alignment, how well they perform on the survey questions, as well as how coherent those chain of emotion traces are. Here's the results that we got in our analysis. So as I said, we got a mean ordinal alignment score of 0.775. There was a big spread across the different clusters. So this is just some clusters are better than this, some clusters are worse than this. In aggregate, we can assume this to be the accuracy, as well as the top one accuracy of 0.679, which is, how often did the answer exactly match the answer that we expect to see from the underlying person that we're trying to model. This is a comparison against existing academic research into the area. Different papers use different types of scores, but as you can see, compared to all of the existing approaches, even the ones that use fine-tuning as well as the ones that use prompting were better than existing state-of-the-art. We would also like to measure bias and variance, because as I said earlier, that's one of the big failure modes of these systems, which is often not measured. On the left, you can see this is a distribution of the demographic traits that we have mined from the underlying clusters. On the left is the distribution of all of the clusters, all 400 of them. On the right is the bottom 50 clusters in terms of how they perform on our survey scores. As you can see, these two distributions look quite similar to each other, which means that we have not fallen into the trap of, only being incorrect for underrepresented populations and only being correct for well-represented populations in the training data. We do have a slight positivity bias. This comes from the base LLM that we use for training. I'm sure you must have all experienced this in your daily use of these models, that they are often quite sycophantic in nature. We've tried our best to remove this, but we still have like maybe a 0.5 on average score above. So it's like if the response was supposed to be 5, the model's going to predict 5.5 on average. We also measured the variance across responses. So that was 1.85 on a 5-point survey scale, which you may often use in user research, like strongly disagree to strongly agree. This is higher than the variance that we see in human beings, but human variance is not 0. In real-world surveys, we see if you run the same survey on the same set of people, like 2 weeks apart, people will have different responses. They can't agree on what they think themselves. And on a 5-point scale, based on the social science research, human beings generally display a variance of 1.27. What we have created is a blueprint for future human simulation. We've already achieved some pretty good results, and I'm excited to see where we go from here. That QR code, if you scan right there, is a link to our technical report or white paper if you'd like to learn more about what we've made. Thank you.